So here's what we've done so far. This chart, and I know for some people charts are helpful for them, help them understand, but for other people charts are not so helpful. They don't think that way, so that's why tonight we have a tangible, physical chart that I'll be able to physically walk through the journey of the people of Israel. So hopefully that'll help some of the pieces fall into place for you. And you'll be seeing the chart also in conjunction with the physical movement. So hopefully that'll help make things click. Now, if you look at this whole section here, up through Jesus, starting with Abraham through Jesus, is all the story of the people of Israel. Before that, God's dealing with all of humanity. And then, of course, after the cross, God's dealing with all of humanity. But this section of the Bible here is the story of the people of Israel. And that's what I'm going to walk through today. And it starts with Abraham, and it starts over here in Babylon. Abraham is from Babylon, the city of Ur, and God calls him to go to a place which was highly unusual. I know today people move all the time, and I'm in Florida, and I grew up in Pennsylvania, but it was not that way in the ancient world. You stayed in your place because your people had been there for millennia, from time immemorial. That's where your people were from. And so if you go to a new place, it's all different. But God calls Abraham to leave his father's family and to go to a new place. And he doesn't even tell him where he's going. He just says, go to a place that I'll show you. So Abraham steps out in faith and moves to Canaan, the land of Canaan. And he's living there as a stranger, as a foreigner in the land of Canaan. And what's happening right now is in the book of Genesis. I'm going to also mention the books that are written as we go through. So Abraham's living here as a foreigner. God says he's going to get this land, but he only gets a small field with a burial cave to bury his wife. That's all he ever gets of it. And he lives his whole life and never owns the land. But God makes him a promise. That's the big theme of tonight, is the promises that God makes. So God makes Abraham a promise, and this is what it says. I asked Neil if he would read the scriptures that I put on the board. Go ahead.
The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you.
So God promises him the whole land of Canaan. This represents the whole land here. And how long is that promise good for? Like sometimes my kids will say, I promise you that for tomorrow you can use this one toy. Just for tomorrow. How long is this promise going to last? According to that verse. Everlasting. It's an eternal promise. He's promising it to Abraham and Abraham's descendants. Okay. So that is the promise of the land. And Pastor George talked about the land and the seed and the blessing. But for today, I just want to focus on that promise to Abraham that he would get this land. Then Abraham's great-grandson, Joseph, got sold by his brothers as a slave down to Egypt in the fertile Nile Valley. He's over in Egypt. So when they all moved down, eventually the whole family moved down. There's 70 of them. Joseph and his brothers and all their kids and wives, and 70 people. And they lived down in Egypt for about 400 years. So imagine how many Jewish people there are after 400 years. Starting with 70, quite a few. Over 1 million. And that's when they're going to leave. But the reason they leave is because while they're there, they're oppressed, they're in bondage, they're in slavery. And so Moses comes, and you can see the Exodus, the little symbol there of them breaking free. And they go and they follow Moses, and there's the 10 plagues and all of that, and they're wandering around for 40 years. And Moses brings them right up to the edge of the promised land, the land that God had promised Abraham. And Moses dies here, and Joshua leads them in. And Dr. Whit Woodard taught us about Joshua coming in and conquering the land of Canaan. And so the Canaanites were conquered, and this land became the land of Israel. Is that straight? Crooked? I know some people, if it's crooked, some people just stare at the crookedness the whole time. That's all they'll be able to see. So after they took it over, they didn't do a great job, but they basically took the whole land over, and it became the land of Israel. So, that led to the period of the Judges. And Dr. Woodard also talked about the Judges. And if you didn't pick up on it, it was not a good time. It was a very dark time. If you read that book, you know how bad it got by the end of the book. It was bad because everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. So during this time period, the books were the Judges and also Ruth. Joshua, Judges, and Ruth is what's covered here. And it gets so bad that at the end of the Judges' time, they reject God as their ruler and they want a king to be like the other nations. Right? Did anyone have a teenage child who said, I want to do what my friends all do. I want to be like them. Their parents let them do X, Y, and Z. Right? My kids are already doing that in elementary school. So, that's what they said. We want to be like the other nations. We want a king. So, they get a king, King Saul. It doesn't go very well. Anybody remember anything about King Saul? Is he a good leader?
He was very prideful.
He was very prideful. He was more focused on his own fame and recognition and respect than he was about how he ran the kingdom. So, he eventually descends into insanity by the end. And so God stops that dynasty. There would have been a dynasty of Saul, a Benjamite dynasty of Saul and Jonathan and son, father to son. But God stops that and puts a new man on the throne, David. And David, when we get to the time of David, God makes another promise to David. David is a man after God's own heart. So here we're going to have another promise. The stars represent promises. And Neil can read this promise that God makes to David.
Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever.
Okay, so again, this is a forever promise, an eternal promise. And what is God promising him?
That somebody from his family will always be king of Israel.
Yes. The dynasty, father to son, will go on forever. So the dynasty and also the kingdom. The walls, the floor is the land, the walls are the kingdom in this. Okay, so I have here something. Aha, here it is. Okay, this is a little flag. This stands for a Davidic king. All right? So that's a promise that God makes. We're going to use that in a moment. There's another promise made regarding David. So you got the promise for the kingdom and a Davidic king. Another promise that God makes regarding David is this. Go ahead, Neil.
So that David, my servant, may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I chose to put my name.
So, the city of Jerusalem, also called Zion, because Zion is the name of the hill on which it's built. This is going to be an eternal city, the city where God chose to put his name, and there will always be a Davidic king ruling in Zion, in Jerusalem. So that's a promise. Then, when David dies, his son Solomon becomes king. And God makes a promise to Solomon also. So we had the kingdom, a Davidic king, and the city, and now God makes a promise to Solomon when he builds the temple.
The Lord said to him, I have consecrated this temple you have built, to put my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there.
So God promises, how long will the temple last? Yeah. So this here is the temple in Zion, and it's a really big deal. It's hard for American Christians to get why the temple was such a big deal, because we understand that the building itself isn't significant. What's significant is the worship that's happening in churches. But the temple was not like that. God's physical presence was there. Now, of course, God is omnipresent. God is everywhere. But in some supernatural way, his presence was there. And in and on what physical object did God's presence reside? Anyone know? The Ark of the Covenant, yeah. Not to be confused with Noah's Ark. Ark just means box. So Noah's Ark was a really big box. This is a box about the size of one of these tables. And it had cherubim on it, carved on it, and God's presence was there in the temple, in the Ark. Imagine what that was like for people living in Jerusalem. To say, this is my house, and this is the baker's house, and that's God's house. And he's in there. And nobody can go into his bedroom. And if you do, you'll die. I know it wasn't a bedroom, but the place where he's actually at. So that having God's presence there with him was amazing. And that was an eternal promise that God made to Solomon. So you got the land, the kingdom, the dynasty, the city, the temple. And then Solomon dies, and his son Rehoboam takes over. And he's a foolish man, a very foolish man. So foolish that the whole country says, we don't want you as our king. And the half the country, more than half, 90% of the country breaks away from the house of David. So they take the name Israel with them. The northern kingdom is Israel. And Rehoboam only keeps the tribe of Judah. He only keeps one of the tribes. So this kingdom becomes Judah, and then by New Testament times it's called Judea. Oh, that's Canaan. Where's Judah? Oh, here's Judah. So Rehoboam keeps one tribe, the southern part, but the other tribes, the other 10 tribes, they break away. Now the land doesn't physically move, but they split off politically and form their own nation. And here is a verse about that.
When all the Israelites heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. Only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the house of David.
So you got Rehoboam, son of David, still ruling here, and you got Jeroboam up north. Now, God says very clearly, the only reason you're even going to be a king is because I made this promise to David. He'd always have a descendant on the throne. So that's why you get that. Okay, now this brings us to, let me not show my hand yet. This brings us to what tonight's really all about, and that's the exile. They're in the kingdom is split. This kingdom, Jeroboam, was a bad, morally bad person. He set up idols for them to worship. The kings of Judah, some were bad and some were good as far as worshiping God or worshiping false gods. But these were all bad. So God punishes them by sending them into exile. And it's going to be over in Babylon. And actually, because the northern kingdom, called Israel, sometimes called Ephraim, because that was the biggest tribe, the most populous tribe. But the northern kingdom goes first, But then eventually the southern kingdom goes into exile also. So this is a key passage. It's a little bit longer, but I'm going to ask Neil to read this because it's a key passage to this whole exile thing. And afterwards we'll talk about why it's so important.
But the Lord, the God of their ancestors, sent word against them by the hand of his messengers, sending them time and time again. For he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they kept ridiculing God's messengers, despising his words and scoffing at his prophets, until the Lord's wrath was so stirred up against his people that there was no remedy.
So that's the reason why he sends them into exile. Now here's a description of the sending, what happens when they get captured and taken.
So he brought up against them the king of the Babylonians, who killed their fit young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary. He had no pity on young men or young women, elderly or aged. He handed them all over to him. He took everything to Babylon, all the articles of God's temple, large and small, the treasures of the Lord's temple, and the treasures of the king and his officials.
So, one of the things covered in gold, gone. The symbol of God's presence. One last little verse about what the Babylonians do.
Then the Babylonians burned God's temple. They tore down Jerusalem's wall, burned all its palaces, and destroyed all its valuable articles. He deported those who escaped from the sword to Babylon, and they became servants to him and his sons.
So God's temple that God had promised would be there forever, destroyed. The kingship, done. Jerusalem, the eternal city where God had put his name, destroyed. And all the people are deported to Babylon, the ones who survived the massacre. That event was so traumatic that it shaped the majority of the Old Testament. So many books are written about it. Either the prophets saying, hey, we better stop or God's going to do this. Lots of books written about this, or books written while they were here saying, you want to know why we're here in this horrible slavery and bondage and exile? Because of what we did, the sins we did. And then also books written saying, but if we turn back to him, God will be merciful. So many books are written revolving around this exile event. And next week, Pastor Neil is going to teach about the return. And there's books all about that. And there's books about people who didn't return, like Esther. So, the exile event was a huge, huge event. Think about the emotional trauma that it would cause. What if all of us were captured, let's say every Christian in America, every true Christian, was captured and sent to China as prisoners of war and slaves. And that was it. Most of us were never going to see America again. Imagine what that would do to us psychologically. I mean, I'm a very patriotic person, and to think I'm never going to see America again. And as I'm raising my kids and they're getting into Chinese culture, I'm going to be like, no, you're Americans. And someday, if you live long enough, you'll be able to go back. And I'd be trying to preserve the traditions. No, we don't do those holidays. We do Christmas and we do Easter and we have the 4th of July, and I'm trying to preserve all that. And the attachment that the Jews had to their country was even stronger than we have to America. Because it was, well, they were there longer. There's a whole lot of reasons. So, it was emotionally traumatic, but what was even worse was that it was spiritually traumatic. Because they're remembering what it used to be, and they're remembering, God, you promised us that land forever. We don't have it anymore. Nebuchadnezzar sent a bunch of Gentiles to live there. And you promised us that kingdom forever, and the city of Jerusalem forever. and a dynasty forever, and the temple will be forever. You made all these promises. You can see how it really looked like God broke all his promises.
But in reality, it was the people that broke the promise.
It was. But some of the promises were unconditional. You're right. And there is an explanation, but I want you to see how difficult it would be for their faith. And many of them did lose their faith at that time. Not all of them, but many of them did. It's important for us too, because there are times when God does things and we cannot see why he would do that. So, here are 2 reasons why you need to know about the exile. The first one is that if you don't understand the exile, there will be many parts of the Bible that won't make sense if you don't understand that. So I'm going to give a couple examples. First example, the book of Daniel. If you don't understand that the Jewish people were taken into exile, the whole book won't make sense. But I just picked one verse as an example.
But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food.
So if you don't understand about the exile, you'll be like, what? Why would the royal food, is this like in the palace in Jerusalem? Is the royal food is like bad? What's wrong with that? Why would that not be kosher food? But if you understand the exile, you're like, well, of course, he's living in a Babylonian king's palace. He's one of the educated people, so he was made a slave in the palace, so essentially an advisor. So of course they're not going to follow kosher laws. And you remember in the first 5 books, there's all those laws about what they can and cannot eat, right? And Jews today still follow those laws. But over in Babylon, they're not going to. So he's got a big moral dilemma. What do I do? How am I going to eat kosher food here? If you understand the exile, at least you'll understand the situation he's in and what's going on. You'll be able to follow the storyline. That's very important. Next example is Psalm 137. Really, the whole psalm, if you don't know about the exile, it won't make any sense. But now that we've talked about the exile, it'll make complete sense. I'm going to have Neil read 5 verses from it. It'll make total sense.
By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs, our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill.
Do you hear the sadness there? We're here by the rivers of Babylon, which would be what rivers? Anybody?
Tigris, Euphrates.
Tigris and Euphrates rivers. We're here, and our captors are like, hey, sing one of those Jewish songs about Zion. How can we sing a celebration to God about his royal city when it's destroyed? And they don't want to forget, you hear that, but there's also a lot of bitterness. I didn't want him to read the whole thing. It ends with, happy is the man who dashes Babylonians' babies against the rocks. It's a very dark psalm. But at least when you understand the exile, you understand what's going on in the story. Okay. Next example is from Ezekiel. Now I know, I've heard a lot of you specifically say Ezekiel's your favorite book in the Bible. And that when you're depressed, you say, you know what? I'm just going to take all Saturday and just read Ezekiel. I just love it. It really cheers me up. But it's there actually are some really interesting parts in it that will make sense when you understand the exile. What happened was God's presence was in the temple in the ark, just hovering above the cherubim. And when God decided to let the Babylonians come in and destroy it all, he couldn't stay there. I mean, if he was there, they would all die. The soldiers would die as they were coming. So God leaves. He abandons the ark. He abandons the temple. He abandons the whole city because his plan is to let Babylon come in and do that. So when you understand what's going on, that makes, for example, this verse in Ezekiel make sense.
Then the glory of the Lord rose from above the cherubim and moved to the threshold of the temple.
So it's above, it rises and it moves to the threshold of the temple. It's in the ark. It goes to the doorway, and then a few verses later it says, and then it moves from the temple to the gate of the city, and then the next chapter, or maybe 2 chapters later, it says, and then he left the city altogether. So I remember as like a 15-year-old reading or trying to read Ezekiel and like not knowing what was going on. The glory of the Lord's rising above the cherubim is moving to like the doorway. What in the world is happening in this book? And I was just muscling through. I'm probably reading like, I don't know, half a page a day because it was difficult to read when you don't know what's going on.
I read, the first book in the Bible I ever read was, I just flipped to it and it was Ezekiel, and I read the whole Bible. I had a book. And I said to Joanne, if this is the way the whole thing is, this is a bloody mess.
Yes. Wow. That's, I don't know how you persevered after that.
I didn't understand all of that.
Yeah.
Sure I didn't, but what a mess.
Yeah. So a lot of the things are hard to understand, but when you get, that's why we're doing this course on the history. When you get the storyline of what's happening, it starts to make some sense. Another example of a book is Lamentations. Raise your hand if you feel like that sounds like a cheerful book. No. It's a bunch of lamentations. What is the author lamenting over? Is it like his wife left him or something? What is he lamenting? Anybody know? No, nobody knows. Nobody ever knows. That's okay, because the first verse tells you.
How deserted lies the city, once so full of people.
He's lamenting over Jerusalem, the city of the great king. That's God's city. People who lived in other cities were like, you can go to Jerusalem and God's there. And so the whole book is a collection of poems lamenting the fall of Jerusalem. And then one more example, I think it's very important, and that is Psalm 89. Psalm 89 is the low point of the Psalms. Some people don't realize that the Psalms are not just randomly ordered. They're ordered carefully under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. It's not exactly a story, but it's thematically organized. And so what happens is there's some praise psalms and some lament psalms, more lament psalms, but it goes from bad to worse, and it gets down about 3/5 of the way through. It gets down to the lowest point, and that's this psalm. And that also functions then as a turning point, and then it moves up into more and more praise. But this is the low point. And let's take a look at it.
I will not violate my covenant or alter what my lips have uttered. Once for all, I have sworn by my holiness, and I will not lie to David, that his line will continue forever, and his throne endure before me like the sun. It will be established forever like the moon, the faithful witness in the sky.
So that sounds kind of positive. Why am I saying it's the low point? Well, look what the next verse says. But you have rejected, you have spurned, you have been very angry with your anointed one, which would be descendant of David. You have renounced the covenant with your servant and have defiled his crown in the dust. So once you see that, you realize all these things about the promises, those are actually bad things. You promised, I will not lie to David, his line will continue forever, his throne will endure like the sun. You made this eternal promise and now it's broken. There's no king. There's no Davidic king. There's no throne. There's nothing. It's just a pile of rubble. And wild animals are roaming through it. So, actually, the psalm, that's verse 34, is really long, talking about all these promises. And at first you think, oh, this is really great. God's going to be true. He's not going to lie. And you get to this and you realize all of that was a big, long complaint. You promised, you promised, you promised, you promised, you promised, and you broke it. Like, how much worse would it be if something horrible happened to you? Like, for example, let's say you're in a car accident and your legs are ruined and you can never walk again. That'd be horrible. It would change your life in a lot of bad ways. But it would be even worse if God had promised you specifically before that, I promise you, you will never lose your ability to walk as long as you live. And then you do. That makes the problem worse because now you're doubting God. So these strong promises before me, like forever, like the moon, like the sun, that makes the problem worse for them, trying to sort through all of this. What's going on? Why are we here? Why did God do that? So all of these promises, these eternal promises, in their minds are just things of the past. You know, they're thinking things like, well, maybe the Babylonian God was stronger than our God. You know, maybe Marduk was stronger than Yahweh. That's the way ancient people, not the Jews who were monotheists, but that's the way most ancient people thought about it. If we come in and take you over, that means our God's stronger than your God. And so they're like, well, maybe all those pagans are right, and I just have one God among many. There's all kinds of questions that this raises, and there's tons of stuff. So that's why there's so many books written about it. Okay, so the first reason is you need to understand the exiles so you can understand the Bible. The second reason is much shorter, but very profound and difficult to grasp at first. But the exile becomes a pattern. Look at this chart here. You've got some leaders here, and then you've got slavery and bondage and exile in a foreign land, and then Exodus. And now again, some leaders, and then slavery and bondage and exile in a foreign land, and then, sorry to steal your thunder next week, but they return. It's another Exodus. And these books actually describe this as a second Exodus. Because there's these biblical authors are sitting here in the exile and they're thinking, this is a lot like that time. And that time, even though it took 400 years, God eventually came and delivered us back to the land that God had promised our ancestor way back. He's going to do it again. And he does do it again. And you can read books like Ezra and Nehemiah and Haggai about coming back and rebuilding. So when you look at that, you see over the course of like 1,000 years that happening. Exile and Exodus. Exile and Exodus. And then those are huge, huge things of the whole nation. And there's tons of little tiny individual story examples. Little individual stories of a person who's, oppressed or something, and God delivers them. And then, so that's on the micro scale, but the macro scale. So that becomes a pattern to know God's personality. What kind of a personality does God have in the way he interacts with human beings? And look at this. Adam and Eve, right? They lived in perfect harmony with God, and they sin, and what's their primary punishment? They're exiled from the garden. And they're cut off from God, and now they're in bondage and slavery to sin and death. And so anybody, through looking at any of this, and us looking back at it, can say, based on what I know about God and how he interacts with human beings, I bet he's going to send another Moses, a better Moses, to deliver us from this exile and this slavery. And he does. He sends a new and better Moses to deliver human beings from their exile, which is their exile from God, from his presence, and their bondage and slavery to sin and death. And of course, he inaugurates a new kingdom, the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. And one day, that kingdom is going to be tangible here on earth. And Almighty God will reign in Zion. Jesus Christ will. So those promises to David that one of your descendants will rule forever, that was a legitimate promise. Jesus really will rule forever in Jerusalem. Eventually, it may be the New Jerusalem, but the promise is good. The point here, one of the applicational points, is that there are things that happen that seem like they have no reason. There is no good reason for God to do that. And some people say, if God would do something like that, and this is a modern day person, then I'm not going to believe in him. Just like the Jews in exile, if God would kill all my family and take me into slavery and destroy and break all his promises, then I'm done with him. I'm just going to go join Babylonian society and forget about that. At the Q&A, if any of you were there, people asked some hard questions. And one lady asked me in private afterwards about her daughter who had died and was suffering, and I think she had leukemia. And she said, I read this book, and I've realized that God would never want something like that to happen, because God is good. But he was just too weak. He didn't have the power to stop it. He loved my daughter. He wanted her to be happy. He wanted her to be healed, but he couldn't. And that really gives me comfort to know that wasn't part of his plan. That wasn't his will. He couldn't do it. I tried to explain to her, the Bible is very clear that God is almighty. But she didn't want to hear that. She reacted very strongly to that because she would rather believe in a weak God than believe that God would do something that she could not see any reason for. And I guarantee you there were people in the exile, maybe some of them had read Isaiah, because Isaiah had about 100 years before the exile had said, this is what's going to happen if you keep doing this. Some of them had read them and were like, it's our own fault. So I can totally see why God did this. But some undoubtedly had not. And they were so sure that they couldn't ever be destroyed because of those promises God made. And then when he did, they couldn't see it. Now, this morning when I explained that, Natalie Ritecki said, God allowed one of my daughters to die. And through that, 11 people on the other side of the family got saved. So Natalie gets to know at least one of the reasons why God allowed that to happen, why that was part of God's will. But many times you don't. Job never got to know why. And so you just have to decide, am I going to trust that I know what's best and I should be running the universe, or that God does? So, what questions do you have about the whole thing? Abraham, going to Egypt, coming back to the land under Moses, kingdom splitting, going to exile. One interesting side note is that what the exile did for them, the ones who did come back, is it purified them, and many stayed. It purified them from idolatry. They had struggled with idolatry through their whole history, even from the patriarchs. Even the patriarchs had idols. They always struggled with that, and when they came back, there was no more of that. That's why in the New Testament they are completely monotheists, and they don't have any problems with that. And so when a guy comes up and says, by the way, I'm God in the flesh, they have a big problem with that. The Greeks didn't. The Greeks would be like, okay, cool, so you're a God in human form, that's great. I mean, at one point, the Greeks think Paul is Zeus. No, Paul is Hermes, and the other guy is traveling with his Zeus. But anyway, they don't have a problem with gods in human form, but the Jews did, because the Jews were done with polytheism altogether. So it sets up, the exile and the purification really sets up for them people to understand exactly how significant it is that God would come to earth.